Hi, it's Dennis Daly. One of the worst things about being a journalist most of my life is to see how coverage of stories, the coverage has changed over the decade, and particularly how the White House no longer treats the press with respect, even though the press, the Fourth Estate, is guaranteed by the Constitution. Many years ago, on the eve of an election, I talked to FORREST Boyd. FORREST Boyd was the longtime White House correspondent for the Mutual Broadcasting System and then a leader in Christian broadcasting. But there was a matter I wanted to talk about first before we started talking about the White House.
I want to go back to a time we were talking about off the air many months ago, and that was when you were working for WLW in Cincinnati. I well remember a woman named Ruth Lyons back there who just dominated broadcasting. If you look back on the early days of TV, it's kind of incredible to think that there were some people out there who just captured our imagination and were kind of Mr. or Mrs. Television in a lot of regional markets.
Yes, I've thought about that recently, specifically about the Ruth Lyons show, which was on every noon, as I recall, and it was on 3 or 4 of stations, Cincinnati, Dayton, Cleveland, Columbus, rather, and Indianapolis.
Yeah. It's really remarkable, not to take the whole show about this one woman, but she was a major player in WLW radio during World War II. Her name became a household word, and then when television first came to Cincinnati, at that time it was owned by the Crosley Company.
Yes.
She had this show, and they called it the 50 Club, and they had 50 people in the audience, and they had so many requests, they called it the 50-50 Club. I can remember visiting my aunt and uncle in Cincinnati. They finally got their tickets. They were for 7 years down the road. Yeah, I don't think they ever got to go to the show.
It was very popular, and as you say, she was very influential in that area.
Forrest, what was it like when television really was just starting in a way in a lot of cities? There were a lot of towns that have TV that did not have television back in the 50s. I know technology was not what it is today, but it must have been frustrating in a way, but exciting to really bring about an industry that was not there just a few years earlier.
That's true. In fact, I worked at Channel 5 in Minneapolis when it was the first station in the upper Midwest. I think there was a station or two in Chicago at that time. But so far as technology is concerned, they didn't have cable or microwave or satellites. So they got their network programming by film, kinescopes. And they would play this on, they just had one projector, and they would make up a big reel and play that. And at the end of that reel, while they were changing to the next reel, one of us in the booth would announce over slides until we got the cue that the next reel was ready to go. So by the time the day was over, the time schedule could slip by several minutes.
Gee, that's funny. I think we should explain kinescope. Because there was no videotape, they actually pointed a movie camera, a special speed movie camera, at a TV screen.
Yes.
And that's why you see a lot of those old honeymooners and early shows recorded that way look so gummy looking.
Yeah, the quality was not very good.
And then, of course, the quality of the transmission. So you were in Minneapolis and then in Cincinnati. I still think that of all the cities in the Midwest, Cincinnati still has a wonderful charm, and it just has a great tradition in entertainment. Rosemary Clooney,
right.
Nick Clooney, who is better known to most people, I guess, as George Clooney's dad, all came out of Cincinnati.
Yes, and Red Skelton, I believe.
Yes, he was from southern Indiana, but spent a lot of time. Then there was a great guy in sports, had the neatest name, Al Shuttlecotty.
Yes.
Never will forget that.
Yes, I think Cincinnati seems to be, in practice, a lot bigger city than it actually is.
And it's got a great symphony, too.
Right.
How long were you in Cincinnati, Forrest?
Well, not very long, actually, because I went there primarily to WLW radio, and then they finally got a license for a TV station in Indianapolis and transferred me over there. I was there when it went on the air.
Boy, you look at the proliferation of channels now, and it's hard to believe there was, in actuality, a time when, as you say, there was just one TV station in some cities.
Yes, and it was very interesting, not only from the standpoint of being the only one, but programming was interesting. They were trying all sorts of things. You may remember the Dave Garroway show in Chicago.
Sure.
Where they had a lot of experimenting. He had horses that they rode on the roof of the Merchandise Mart building where NBC studios were.
Oh, good heavens.
And Chicago originated a lot of good shows in those early days.
Forrest, let's talk about the matter at hand. Here we are. The inauguration is on everyone's mind. Let's spend some time, if we can, tapping your brain about how not only the media has changed, but technology has changed. Let's talk about the technology first. The inauguration will be covered with hundreds of high-quality color cameras and microphones all over the place, all strung together wirelessly with microwave dishes. I was told that when television first came here to Washington, D.C., the phone company had great big refrigerator-sized boxes all over the city, and you had to back your truck up, open the door, and hook your cable in.
Yes, I think that's true, and in fact they had sort of a similar arrangement for radio, too. I remember in the Kennedy assassination, when they had the funeral, almost within a few hours, AT&T had put different locations all along Pennsylvania Avenue and practically all over downtown Washington where radio could tap in. And as you say, we didn't have any wireless arrangement at the time for broadcast.
You know, it's kind of funny. You and I take the phone company for granted. Those of us who were in broadcasting and were in it before the age of satellite communications, you ate, breathed, and slept with the phone company practically because everything went through their wires.
That's exactly right. Both locally and long distance. They had, I think, something they called long lines. Maybe they still do, a department that networks used for hooking up stations all over the country.
We might point out that right now you are in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and I'm here downtown. It sounds as if you're across the table from me, and that's through a new technology called ISDN. A lot of people know that because they're using it to get their computers hooked up.
Right. And I suppose fiber optics is going to make some changes, too.
Of course, the question is, with all of this data and 200 TV channels to watch, I guess the standard joke is the more channels you've got, the less there is to see.
It seems like it, doesn't it?
Forrest, you mentioned the Kennedy assassination day. I guess this is the question everybody asks journalists at least once. Where were you when you got the news?
I was in the Mutual newsroom. And our newscaster, Charlie Warren, was just wrapping up a newscast, I think on the half hour. And we got a call from New York, said, hey, you better check the wires. And there's just one little line, something to the effect, Kennedy shot or reportedly shot. So I carried that bulletin in to Charlie, and he just kept continuing the newscast. And I kept taking one little piece of information from the different wire services to him. I think we stayed on the air constantly for 2 days, just going with reports. And suddenly, as I said, we had various locations available where we could do live broadcasts. And then we began to call in correspondent reports.
A mutual, if I may use that word as a pun, also friend of ours, the late Jaffrey Ford.
Yes.
Who was an anchor at Mutual. When I was there for a brief while, we dragged out the tapes of that day, and one Saturday about 10 of us went into the newsroom and we threaded them up and listened to them, and it was really spooky. We played it pretty much in real time as to what time of day it would have been. Of course, no one thought to start the recorder early. Mm-hmm. Everybody missed the first little bit of it because no one thought it was going to be, that dramatic. They had so many other things on their mind. It's a shame that we in broadcasting, if I may say this, seem to shine the most in tragedy. All of the really great moments I can remember, and I use the word great guardedly, when your adrenaline got pumping and everybody heard about it and came in and volunteered to work, and you were hitting on all cylinders, seemed to be in times of tragedy, and that's a shame.
Yes. Let me ask you, were you as impressed listening to the tapes as a person would have been listening to it live?
I think so. I, being in radio, was listening to it with an ear to what else was going on, if you know what I mean, trying to share the experience of trying to put this incredible, fast-moving story together. Mm-hmm. One of the spooky things about it was the constant mention of the grassy knoll.
Yes.
Because of either a real gunman there or the acoustics in Dealey Plaza, everybody kept saying the shots came from there.
Mm-hmm.
But it was indeed a spooky experience. Did you stay there most of the night?
I can't remember right now. I wouldn't be surprised if I did, because I remember they needed everybody they could get.
I was amazed in a way with the rapidness with which President Kennedy's body was brought back here to Washington. Once the death was confirmed, and who was it? Judge Sarah Hughes, I guess, administered the oath of office to Lyndon Johnson in Air Force One, and then the first thing we know, Johnson was making that tear-jerking speech at Andrews Air Force Base where he said, "I would rather be doing anything else but this."
Mm-hmm. Yes, that, another experience, you're talking about how radio and television also respond to these tragedy sort of things. One thing I think will stick in everybody's mind is watching O.J. Simpson's Bronco going down the freeway.
That infamous slow-speed chase, yeah.
Exactly. And you didn't have to say anything, really. Just keep watching that.
You know, there is something that I, not to put words in your mouth, but that I find sad about the way broadcasting is going. Edward R. Murrow may not have been a saint, but he certainly had a way with words.
Right.
You look back at the people who had to paint pictures on radio. The people, even H.V. Keltonborn with that stilted delivery he had, the people who prior to television had to convey the message solely by the spoken word. That's a dying art.
Yes, and it's hard to keep in mind. I was covered an event in Philadelphia one time, and there were a number of radio reporters sitting there, and one announcer next to me was doing an especially good job, and I asked him during a break who he was working for, and he's working for a blind network, radio network. And then it dawned on me, all of our listeners are blind, really. They're depending on us to describe what's going on. So I took a cue from that we should always try to describe. Describe.
My special guest is Forrest Boyd, a veteran Washington, D.C. news commentator and reporter. Before the break, we were talking about a variety of things, including the fact that sometimes you have to really over-describe things for radio to paint wonderful pictures. Forrest, to get back to that, but enlarge the topic just a little bit, isn't it difficult, though, to strike a fine line between over-describing something and ending up getting in the way, being obtrusive, as it were?
Yes, and you sort of, because of television, I guess, tend to assume that people are seeing what you're talking about.
But it is amazing, and statistics will show that a large number of television sets are actually used as radios, that people are ironing clothes or driving a, cab with the TV on, for heaven's sake, but a lot of television is only listened to.
That's right, and when I first started in television, a producer kept expressing to us that we should show the pictures, don't talk, show the pictures. But if people aren't watching it, they at least could listen if something's being said.
There's a great announcer here in Washington, Ed Walker,
yes,
who has been blind since birth, and I did an interview with him one time, and we got talking about television. He said the best show on TV was MASH, because it was all dialogue.
Yes.
It was radio with pictures. You know what the worst show for him was?
No.
Mission Impossible.
Uh-huh.
He said there were periods when it was just bump, 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 bump. And, of course, they're doing all this gadgetry, had no idea what was going on.
Right.
Forrest, what did you want to be as a student? If I may patronize you here by saying that you not only have, I think, one of the most pleasant voices on radio, but you are, in the true sense of the word, very articulate, and of course you have to be. What did you want to be when a dentist or?
Well, let me go back to. You mean when I was like in grade school?
Yeah, when you were growing up. Fireman.
I think I had about 3 different things I'd like to be. I thought I'd like to be an airplane pilot, or a professional baseball player, but always I wanted to be in radio. And I lived 125 miles from Chicago, so I could hear the Chicago radio stations, and I would go around the house doing their station breaks. WLS Chicago, WGN Chicago, all of those.
Wow.
And I would make up commercials whenever I had to do a little show and tell in school, in class, I would write a radio program and enlist some other people, and we'd do news and commercials and everything. But I never had the foggiest notion of how to go about that. And lo and behold, that's what I ended up doing.
Well, you know, Ed McMahon told me that when he was growing up, I think he was raised by his grandparents in Malden, Massachusetts. He used to go in the parlor. You know, houses used to have parlors.
Yes.
And shut the big doors and use a flashlight as if it were a microphone and pretend to be on radio.
Yes, it's something that kind of gets in your blood. They talk about printer's ink, but there's something about radio, too.
You know, you mentioned those great Chicago stations. That's something else I think we lack today. We don't really need it. But in an era before small towns like Lawrenceville, Illinois, and small Jasper, Indiana had their own radio stations, the people in those areas at that time, largely living on farms, listened to these big 50,000-watt stations at night because all the little stations on those frequencies went off the air so they could be clear channel. That was their connection to the outside world.
That's right, and those stations had a tremendous coverage. It wasn't so great for local commercials, but if you had a message you wanted to get out, that was the way to go.
Well, something else, too. Before electricity came to the farm, people better hope that in the middle of the Grand Ole Opry or whatever, their batteries didn't run out.
Yes, that's true, too. We used to have several batteries, A batteries and C batteries.
Forrest, the matter at hand is, of course, inauguration 1997. Before going on the air, you said the first inauguration you covered was for Mutual. It was Lyndon Johnson's first inauguration. Where were you positioned there on the parade route?
I was on the corner of Pennsylvania and 15th, right there by the Treasury Department, and which was a good location because the parade had to make its turn there. And so I got to describe every once in a while what was going past that location.
Isn't there something magic about hearing Hail to the Chief played? I mean, I know we don't live in a society where, you know, we have kings with ultimate power and that kind of thing, but it's about the only kind of royalty, in a way, we have in this country. I just get kind of goosebumply every time I hear ruffles and flourishes and Hail to the Chief.
I guess next to the national anthem, that would be true.
Now, you covered that there. The parade at that time, and I've not seen an inaugural parade, they can be rather lengthy events.
Oh, they go for several hours, yes. And especially in the extremely cold weather, that's a long time.
You know, I know the Founding Fathers had their own idea for it, but it amazed me that the inauguration used to be in March before they changed it to January. You know, we have enough problems now with lame duck presidents lasting from November to January. Those extra months must have been kind of crazy. Now, by that time, when Johnson was in, we still didn't have a lot of microwave. Had some wireless mics, I guess, but everything was pretty well on cable, and just there must have been miles of wire down there by the White House.
Well, I'm sure there was. In fact, you know, there had to be, for radio, there had to be actually a broadcast line installed at each location where we had an announcer describing the parade.
Do you remember what the weather was like?
On that?
Because we've had some terrible inaugurations here.
Yes. It seems to me like every inauguration has been extremely cold.
Well, for the Kennedy, you know, the Army had to get out and plow the street the night before.
Right, and I guess at the inaugural balls, the night of the inauguration, people, it took them hours to get home because of the snow.
Then, of course, we had, was it Reagan's second, I guess, where it was actually so cold they called it off.
Yes, they had an inauguration at the White House, or he was sworn in at the White House. Now, I don't know if the next day they had a public swearing in or not, but I do remember on that Sunday, Reagan went to the National Cathedral to a church service, and it was terribly cold and a lot of snow.
Then we've had a few times when the weather's been really great, but I think you're absolutely right. All the ones I have seen on television, everybody's just bundled up, and you can see their breath even from across the lot.
Yes, that's certainly true. And one interesting thing about that Reagan inauguration, when they canceled it, Nellie Gray had her March for Life with all of those people marching through the streets through that kind of weather.
Oh, good heavens. Forrest, after that then, the next inauguration, you were a little bit more seasoned. I would think really the toughest part for a reporter being out there even a seasoned reporter is really dealing with the fact that you're probably switching around all over the place. It must be a nightmare for the director just to get your cues right.
That's true, and we always had a run-through, switching to so-and-so here and so-and-so there. So it worked out pretty well, but one thing that seems to always happen, you get a lot of things in your mind you like to say, and you just get started, and they say, well, thanks a lot, Forrest, and now we go to the next location.
That person also has a list in their mind
exactly
of the things they wanted to say.
Right.
You spent a lot of hours in the White House press room. Let me ask about that. I visited Helen Thomas down there and Bill Small, and they all tell me the same thing. The White House is the most wonderful beat. It's great prestige. You're at the center of everything, but it can be boring at times.
Oh yes, it's stop and go sort of thing. Some days you can't keep up with everything, and then some days there just seems to be nothing to do. And I always tried to save some things to do, like writing or getting records back in shape or something like that. One time, one of the newspapers, I think it was the Washington Post, assigned a person to fill in at the White House on a Monday, this during the Johnson administration. And he wrote a column that was titled, "The White House Can Be," well, it's boring was the word. That wasn't the word he used, but that's what he meant. And he said everybody's sleeping and lounging around and reading books and so forth. He forgot to say that that was a Monday after we had been out with Lyndon Johnson on a campaign trip that was just horrendous so far as hours and taking energy was concerned.
You know, you bring up an interesting point. I remember a lesson back in college. A professor gave a scenario where a young reporter had gone to a city to cover a Ku Klux Klan rally. And there were 6,000 people there in this town of 600. And, of course, the story the young person brought back was a huge crowd of KKK members was in the little tiny town of Ionia, Vermont, or whatever it was. And the professor said, now, is there anything wrong with that story? And none of us picked up on it. He said, what would have happened if there'd been 15,000 Klansmen there the week before and only that number that week? You would have said a surprisingly small number, or 1/3 the number from the previous week. And so I guess that's the toughest thing. You have to put everything in perspective. Traveling with the president, Forrest, what's that like?
It can be very frustrating and wearing. At one point, well, probably I guess at several points when I was traveling with the presidents, I felt like a walking zombie. And it was such that when we went to Miami one time, I put a note beside my bed saying, "You are in Miami. You don't have to be anywhere." Because I still wake up sometimes having had a kind of a dream thinking that I missed the bus or I couldn't find the press room or something. It's
you still have those dreams?
Yes, I do.
Hold on, it went off again. You know, it's funny. I have dreams every so often that I'm getting ready to do a newscast, and none of the buttons will work.
Yeah, well, that's the idea. I either can't find paper or a typewriter or or something, or I get into a studio and I've left my copy someplace else. But so far as the White House travel is concerned, it's always a problem of making sure you're at the right place at the right time. We were in Cincinnati one time. We mentioned Cincinnati earlier. The president was there and was going up to Cleveland afterwards. And Larry Speaks was deputy press secretary at that time, was watching out for 2 or 3 of us radio folks who were trying to file before we left. He says, just keep me in your sight because I won't let you miss a press bus. So we finally wrapped up and ran downstairs with Larry, and the press bus was just going around the corner. And we missed it. We couldn't catch up with them at the airport. A couple of us finally hitched a ride with a CBS courier plane that was going up there. And so that's the constant worry. I guess it's the only time I missed a bus or a plane or something, but you always think that might happen.
when the president he travels, he has a little bit more plush accommodations, somebody to hold his hand, as it were.
Well, and he can sleep on Air Force One also.
That's right. He's got that airborne bedroom.
Yeah, and I think they have a special adrenaline or something that keeps him going as well.
You mentioned Larry Speaks. I always thought that was a great name for a spokesman.
Right.
He went on, of course, to be press secretary. What is the relationship like between the reporter and the press secretary? And I, having not been down there, am not a good one to guess, but I would think one of the hardest things is figuring out whether or not you're really getting a straight answer.
Well, that is the problem. Of course, you know the story of Ron Ziegler acknowledging at that time that what he had said previously was no longer operative. And once you hear that, you never take at face value what a government spokesman says.
Yeah, once you lose your virginity, as it were, on that issue, you can't go back.
There's no way to recapture it.
Did you like working with those guys? Did you find that you could go off the record and say, hey, you know, what's going on here?
Well, I tried my best, and of course that is the whole game is to cultivate sources that you can depend on. And it's not always just the press office where you find those sources. You have to figure out some people, other places where you can double check.
Did you know John Scali?
Yes, I did.
He was with ABC. Am I right in saying he was somewhat of a go-between during the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Cold War?
They used him for a messenger, you might say. He had lunch with a Soviet, somebody from the Soviet embassy, I presume, at a restaurant in downtown D.C., and they Scali learned something from this Russian, I think, and then got some information for him. Anyway, yes, he was used. I don't think improperly.
One of the other things a lot of people don't realize is one of the great sources of information, not so much for the press, but for many in and around the State Department, are our embassies overseas, that they are indeed, and I'm not going to use the word spying points here, but indeed grand listening posts. And I'm sure a lot of that is what these people overhear in restaurants.
Yes, that's certainly true. A lot of that's going on that we don't know anything about.
Forrest, let's get into two other areas here. And again, thanks for taking the time on this busy weekend to join us. We did a little piece some months ago about this topic, and I don't want to dwell on it forever, but your perception as to how the media has changed in the years you've been in broadcasting, particularly in trying to uncover everything that's in anybody's closet. I mean, it's almost impossible to run for office anymore.
Yes, when I started covering the White House, there was sort of a gentleman's agreement that you didn't tell everything you knew. And people did know or thought they knew quite a few things about President Kennedy and then President Johnson and others. And it wasn't until, I think, the Bobby Baker incident, who was an aide to Lyndon Johnson as Majority Leader of the Senate, got in some trouble, and somebody reported it. And I think that was the beginning of this reporting things that otherwise had not been considered newsworthy. And so now, you know, you have people asking very personal questions.
Do you think that's good? If you were still there, from the school of journalism and the gentility you have, would you feel uncomfortable being around that?
Yes, I think I would. There's some things I still think are not necessary, although the people have a right to know about the people they elect as well. So I guess I have mixed feelings about it.
The final area I want to get into is something that you've been involved in for a long time after leaving the commercial networks. You were with IMS, which again was International
Media Service,
which supplied programming to Christian radio stations. You still, for us here at UPI and on other outlets, are heard doing commentaries on ethics and religion. I'm happy to see that religious journalism is finally being recognized. There are even a couple colleges in this country where you can study journalism and ethics and religion. Could you kind of put into perspective how you have seen the religious broadcaster and his or her role change over the last decade or so?
Well, it's changed in a couple of ways. When we started IMS, there wasn't any kind of a news service for, especially with the Christian stations in mind. The religious stations were strong on ancient history, teaching the Bible and so forth, and on the future prophecy, but didn't know or didn't recognize what's going on right now. That's where the news fit in. So it took a period of education to get the stations to even carry any kind of news unless they originated it themselves. And the other thing, though, that has happened is a lot of the stations have gone what I would call pretty much political and getting involved in advocacy sort of positions. So you have a lot of talk shows. In fact, I think some of the talk shows started on religious stations rather than commercial stations. So far as call-ins are concerned anyway. So they've become, many of them have become quite a force in political affairs. And as you know, both Dole and Clinton used Christian stations for some of their commercials this time.
I remember one night in the newsroom, I got a call from a Christian radio station from a young, very energetic fellow, and he was taking great exception with the fact that I had used a story about Playboy magazine. Now, you know me well enough to know that I don't like sex kickers. There are certain words that I don't even use on the air. I mean, I still think there should be a degree of gentility. But it was a story about how if a person had enough money, they could have their wife or girlfriend photographed in a mock version of Playboy magazine. That's all I said. Didn't go into detail. Well, this young fellow thought I was wasting 30 seconds. And I finally asked him, I said, now, you can't shelter your listeners from everything. He said, well, that's a social evil. I said, okay, let's look at it this way. Shouldn't I alert your listeners to what's wrong with society? Mm-hmm. And then let them work on it?
Yes.
So it's a genuinely fine line. I find that some of the Christian broadcasters, although they are our greatest allies in many ways, and this is not a criticism at all, really are so evangelistic that it's hard for them to be objective journalists. But of course they say the same thing about us, that we are the left-wing liberal bias media. So I think we need to strike some common ground there someplace.
And my approach was that I was reporting what I thought people ought to know, not what they agree with or what I agree with, but just facts about what they ought to know.
And it's so difficult, really, sometimes to present both sides of the story because you don't always have access to both sides on the same day.
That's right. So one day you may report one side and the next day the other side.
What are the current social issues that you find yourself either commenting on the most or getting the most feedback about now?
Well, there's gambling, for example. There's pornography. There's separation of church and state, religious freedom issues, abortion, pro-life. The partial birth abortion issue has been one of the biggest ones in the last year. That sort of thing.
The other thing about that, too, is the fact that I really cringe every time I hear a radio station that has little, if any, news. I mean, I know ratings are important, and I know people love to play music. Maybe I'm from the old school, but if there was ever an era in which we do not need an ill-educated public, it's now.
That's right. There's no virtue in being ignorant, the way I see it.
Forrest, where are you going to be for the parade this year? Watching it at home?
That's right. I hope to avoid being there entirely.
Might be a mite chilly.
That's true.
Forrest Boyd, I want to thank you for taking the time to join us, and keep up the good work. You have certainly provided a lot of great listening for us over the years, and I want to thank you for being my guest.
Well, I thank you.
He was a genuine gentleman. Forrest Boyd. I'm Dennis Daly.